So we will have an open discussion now. This room is filled with leaders on this issue, and please just indicate to me if you would like to speak, and you will get the floor. And please, if each person, Bettina, if you can introduce yourself each time that you take the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Bettina Hagedorn from Germany, and I'm the State Secretary of Olaf Scholz from the Finance Minister in Germany. And he is very sad that he is not with us here today in Vatican, but I think you all know that it's very important for him, as he is also the vice leader of his party, of our party, the Social Democratic Party in Germany, that his place today needs to be in Berlin, and I hope, but the best greetings from him. So first of all, I would very much like to thank Bishop Sanchez Sorondo, Minister Loren, and Jeffrey Sachs, for inviting us here and having the initiative to have this taken place today, and I'm very grateful for that. Germany very much welcomes the engagement of Pope Francis in the topic climate protection. The engagement of the Pope gives direction and orientation for so many people in the world, and especially, as we all know, since last year, especially to the young generation. And it was very impressive, and my colleague from Sweden, she already pointed out that it was the biggest demonstration of young people around the world last Friday, and we should take this push and not disappoint the demands of the young people, because it's their future more than ours. And so the Paris Agreement and the recently adopted rulebook for its implementation in Katowice, we have a robust common framework in place to address global warming effectively. Even more international cooperation is the key. And we know that we, the finance ministers, have an important role to play in fighting climate change. And for this reason, the German Minister of Finance, Olaf Scholz, acted as founding member of the Coalition of Finance Ministers of Climate Action in April 2019. Let me just say a few words about the situation in Germany. The transformation towards a less carbon-intensive economy is a political and financial exertion. We have made the far-sighted decision of phasing out coal as an energy source until 2038. I think that is not, yes, we should reach this goal earlier. But we have a coalition, and as you all know, it's difficult to get all members, like the ministers who are responsible for agriculture or for traffic or for economy, on the side, because of course the things that need to be decided are not very popular to the people, and so we have a big challenge. But as a matter of fact, you all know that Germany also decided a long time ago to leave the nuclear energy, and so we have the double step to take, and we are in the industrialized country, so it's very important, as my colleague from Sweden said, to take the people with us, because they have to agree to what we chose for steps, and they do not have to pay for it, and not the ones who have less money, who have less income. They shouldn't feel that our political decisions are a threat for them. So it needs to have it socially balanced. And as we all know, even in the 90s, when we defined sustainable development, we knew from the beginning on it doesn't only depend on the climate affairs or energy, but it also has a big social impact and for the next generation. And so we have to take this into our mind. In Germany, we have we increased the share of renewable energy in total electricity consumption sharply from 6% in 2000 to up to 38% in 2018. And so we have to go further, but at least it shows that you can do it if you make it seriously. And we have, in this year, we have a climate coalition within the government, so that the ministers of agriculture, economy, and traffic, with the Minister of Finance and with the Chancellor, they all together have to define the steps and the goals and make them real, and say how fast they promise to achieve this,
Yeah, we'll do that.
because otherwise we will not achieve the goals, and we know that. We of course are very glad that Finland will start with the leadership in Europe in the summer, because we will do so in the second half of 2020, and we all know that this is the very important time to put up the framework from 2021 for the European budget. And we know that it's very, the countries in Europe have very different opinions how big the budget should be and for what it should be given away, the money. And so I think this is historical for Europe. We might fail, but we do not have to fail, because if we would fail, we would get this chance not ever again. And so I hope very much, and there is a coalition within Europe, that 25% of the budget should be reserved for this climate change efforts. Wow. And I would very much hope that we would be able to do this together. But I want to point out that, of course, it's not only the height of the budget, it's also the quality, what we pay for it. And we know that a lot of ideas like CCS in the North Sea and stuff like that is something that people want to get paid from the European budget, and we have to discuss if that really is the right way, or if there are more effectful for the climate, more effectful projects that we should rather pay for. Thanks a lot.
Excellent. Thank you for fantastic comments. I think when it comes to failure, we should go with the wonderful phrase of Gene Kranz, who was the NASA mission control leader, who, of course, said failure is not an option. And they brought home Apollo 13 on that basis. So I think you're going to make it, and thank you for Germany's leadership in this. The floor is open. I would. Yes, of course. Nadia, Minister Santa Maria of Spain.
Yeah, do I need to? It's already working. Okay. So thank you very much for the invitation. Warmest congratulations to those organizing this event. And I also come with a very good result of yesterday's elections. They were not only European elections, also local elections in Spain, just a month after the general national elections. And the result has been very favorable to the party which is currently in government, with a very strong agenda of the Global Development Goals. So this will be my first point. I would just like to make three brief remarks. The first point is that the Spanish government is absolutely determined to make the Global Development Goals the heart of its action and the structural reforms going forward. We have a special envoy for the 2030 agenda. We have been, in this first year in government, setting the basis for structural reforms we call an agenda for change, which has as one of the key pillars fighting climate change and environmental protection. The fact that the population has supported this agenda, I think, is extremely important because, as we were just discussing a moment ago with Mr. Sachs, it comes in a country which is also having to face a number of imbalances from the crisis. We have not fully recovered, so it is remarkable that people having difficulty still see that climate change, fighting climate change and the environmental agenda is something that should be pushed, even though it may have costs in the short run. This would be my second point, is that I think it's absolutely a key, and Mr. Sachs said it in his presentation, that we make sure that this transition is a fair transition. Those that are more vulnerable are more directly impacted by the costs inherent to the change. And so it's extremely important that we make it visible, that we're aware of the economic impact, and that we do our utmost to not only implement what economic theory has been telling us for decades, internalization of negative externalities, creating carbon markets and all these elements, but also thinking about social justice, not only intergenerational justice, which is something that we're increasingly aware of, but also these intra-societal fairness vis-à-vis those persons which are more directly impacted. My third point is that the challenge here is to turn the challenges and the difficulties into opportunities, creating this positive agenda, which I think is exactly what we're trying to do in so far as the Spanish government is concerned, and what we have been doing is trying to support very strongly research and development in this area, increasingly devote attention to environmental challenges. Second element is public investment is of course necessary, but it is not sufficient to do the massive investment which will be necessary. We need to mobilize private investment. We think that legal certainty is extremely important, and that's why we sent the National Plan of Energy and Climate, which was considered to be the best by the European Commission, by the way, precisely to give this midterm perspective. How are the coal mines and coal fire plants be removed from the system? What about nuclear? To give this very detailed calendar and perspective so that private investors also know what is expected from them and are more encouraged to invest. A third element that we have been focusing a lot on is, as I was saying, ensuring a fair transition. We reached an agreement with the unions of the coal miners to ensure that there will be support for those persons which are directly involved. We will also try to integrate these environmental criteria into public contracting and public markets in order to integrate these more qualitative elements also when we decide on the companies to create the right incentives. And finally, we also think it's key to have solidarity with development countries, with less advanced countries. We need to, this is a global challenge, we need to also support all the international funds which have been created. We know within the limits of our budgetary constraint, being an economy minister, I have to talk about the budgetary constraint. But we're trying to support all the green funds and climate funds that are being created around in order to have this global action. In a nutshell, we are very supportive of this process. We want to be at the vanguard of changing, creating opportunities out of these challenges. The ostrich attitude of trying to ignore it and then wake up when it's too late doesn't go with our character. And so you can count on us supporting this process, which I think is extremely helpful. Thank you.
Let me start by congratulating my colleagues that have just come from successful elections. We had elections not so long ago about air quality and lower energy bill in Iceland. This was in 1938 in Reykjavik, when we wanted to move from burning coal to geothermal. And in the meantime, we've succeeded in securing almost 100% of our energy needs for electricity and heat through renewable resources. And in other sectors, such as in the fisheries fleet, we are seeing a big transformation at the moment, with emissions coming down since 1990 around and over 40% due to new technology, investment into better vessels, better technology, and now we are slowly turning to the cars, and we are building up infrastructure for vehicles in Iceland. But we are, of course, very dependent upon the car manufacturers and the technology being there. And we see it is coming, and we will make use of anything that the production lines will bring us to make sure that we are on track with our goals. So let me also state that, of course, the impact of climate change is very visible and noticeable in the high north, possibly more than anywhere else in the world. We do see glaciers receding every year. This is having a dramatic effect on the landscape, but also on the capacity in the short term for hydro power plants. We see different routes for the fish stocks around Iceland. They are reacting to the rapid changes in the sea. We see new species. Let me name for an example, mackerel we had not seen in abundance until recently, and it is now becoming a new reality, new opportunity, but it is still the same stock. It's just the fish is swimming in different waters. So we see very definitely that the change is happening around us. Now, I'd like to mention twofold participation on our behalf in this very important matter. We are, of course, a rather scarcely populated nation, 350,000 people. So first, we'd like to set an example. I mentioned that we are almost 100% renewable when it comes to electricity and heating through hydropower and geothermal. So we would like to set an example for the energy transformation, where we have, over the decades, moved increasingly to our current state, as I have mentioned earlier. And to this effect, we are members of the High Ambition Coalition and aim for this government that was created in 2017. We do aim for total carbon neutrality from 2040, so 10 years ahead of time compared to the goal that was presented here and we all know about. And we aim for not allowing new combustion cars to be imported after 2030. Again, well, we hope that, if the technology will be there, we will be ready. So we're not a big car manufacturer, but the infrastructure is there, the energy is there, and the incentive is certainly there, because we'd like to stop importing foreign oil and just use the energy that we already possess. And it is, we have been blessed with abundance of energy. So we will be ready for that. And secondly, let me lastly name another reason why we really do want to take part and where we believe we can have an impact. And this is to distribute the knowledge that has been created through the usage of natural resources in Iceland. Let me just name very briefly two examples. So our scientists, they have found the technology to turn CO2 into methane and use it as an energy source. The plant has been built in Iceland. Now another plant is being built in China. And at the end of the day, the technology or the technology that was created at the site of a power plant that was emitting CO2 into the air, that power plant is now driving the new energy plant, which is creating methane. Now that technology is being exported to China, a plant is being built there. At the end of the day, it will save emissions which are far in abundance of all emissions of Icelanders. And another example would be the technology of capturing CO2 and turning it into mineral and then just drilling it down into the. These are just two examples, very recent examples, where we'd like to contribute. And I could also mention the participation of Icelandic scientists, engineers, and others in geothermal projects around the world. So lastly, I think we just all need to think about moving away from the culture of consumption. This, of course, requires a changed mindset, and it is hard for government to accomplish that alone. We need the general public to take part, but the general public will only take part if the right incentives are there and if it makes sense. Let me name, for example, we recently imposed ban on the use of plastic bags. The general public likes it so and so. They want to take part. They see the necessity because of the plastic in the ocean, but they don't like it when they see that others are not taking part. And this is disrupting their day-to-day life, whilst 90% of the problem is not being addressed. That is a challenge for politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and very exciting, first of all, to have the 2040 date, and Iceland is really a fabulous example of using your resources effectively and ingeniously as well, and I'm happy that this notion that the minister mentioned of carbon capture and storage in Iceland is being discussed. That was a project together with our colleagues at Columbia University, actually. They had the idea together with the Reykjavik Power Company that the carbon dioxide coming from the geothermal energy, if put back down into the magma because of Iceland's plate tectonic characteristics, would quickly mineralize. And they did an experiment isotopically labeling the CO2 so you could follow it afterwards, and sure enough, it turned right into mineral deposits. So it's a great way to capture carbon dioxide. It stays where you put it. We had a colleague at Columbia who used to show pictures of Iceland with huge towers capturing the world's CO2 and putting them down. So maybe you will actually play that role effectively in the future. And I think that, and as you said, creating green methane from the CO2 and the renewable energy is another example, coming back to what Christian Breyer was talking about. If you take CO2, you take clean energy, you hydrolyze the water to hydrogen, and then through so-called Fischer-Tropsch reactions, combine the hydrogen and the CO2, you can end up with lots of things. You can end up with liquid hydrocarbons, you can end up with methane gas, but basically you make clean fuel carriers that are like fossil fuel carriers chemically, but are made in a sustainable manner. So this is also extremely exciting. Minister Czerwinska, if I could ask you, thank you for the leadership at Katowice last year, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank for the invitation and also say that I highly appreciate this initiative and congratulate my colleagues who also recognize the importance of this initiative. And I would like to touch 2 points. First of all, I would like to refer to one of the Sustainable Development Goals, namely that it is absolutely crucial that we undertake appropriate actions combating climate change and its consequences. One has to bear in mind, however, that the societies of poorer countries are first and foremost striving to improve their lives. If the climate-related actions are overly radical and badly designed, they will simply be rejected. Furthermore, the citizens of middle-income countries such as Poland do not accept being stuck in the middle-income trap. Therefore, the social dimension of our efforts should be at the center of our attention, and we should prepare our actions in social inclusive way. The fight against climate change requires a huge economic transition. It should be just, taking into consideration all the local conditions and limitations. It should also ensure the protection of the most vulnerable groups and regions. The wealthy, high developed countries have a very important role to play. If is the consumption model relevant there, which makes these countries actually responsible for the emission of greenhouse gases? Even when they limit emissions from their territories, they cause pollution in the poorest countries where the industry is located. What this all means is that the habits of the citizens in the wealthy states have to be changed. Not only consumption models have to be different, but the people must be converted to the ecology, a priority which is very much in line with the words of St. John Paul II. And my second point, thank you. And also I add my second point to this speech because Mr. Jeffrey Sachs said that we should not only discuss, but also we should act as fast as possible because it is no time for discussions, for divagation, but we have prepared action plan. And many of you mentioned green bonds as an important financial tool, and I'm glad to share with you our experience with the issuance of green bonds. In 2016, Poland was the first country in the world to open this market, which is now developing dynamically. This year, we continued our efforts to mobilize finance for climate action by issuing a third and fourth series of green bonds. So currently, Poland is the first sovereign with 4 green bonds outstanding. Our intention is to regularly issue green bonds in the future to actively support climate action in Poland. The funds raised have enabled us to finance many important climate-friendly investments. We also expect an increased interest on this instrument among Polish local authorities. What is crucial with such issues, besides the assessment of the market and budgetary situation, of course, is the availability of environment projects capable of being financing from the state budget. We are very open to sharing our experience with those who wish to enter this market, and I'm open with my team to bilateral contacts in this respect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. No, thank you very much. And I think it's, I really want to thank you for your words. This is not an easy subject for Poland, given also the long, large role of the coal industry in the country, and obviously all of the economics that you pointed to. I am lucky to know Poland well for the last 30 years, and you've done one miracle after another. And maybe John Paul II had a lot to do also with the miracles, but I think what you're doing and your leadership is extremely important and very impressive. So thank you very much for that. I'd like to ask Minister Andersson of Sweden next.
Thank you. For those of you that were at the lunch we had in Washington, I think I ended my speech there by saying that climate change is happening here and now, and we have all the facts. We know what we should do. We just have to do it. So I was going to elaborate a bit on what we should do and how we can actually do it. And I have 3 points, 3 examples on what we have done in Sweden. And I would like to start by the fact that we have, since 2017, we now have a climate policy framework in Sweden, which is important for all the policies that we are implementing from the government side. It's inspired by the fiscal policy framework that I think many of our ministers of finance are familiar with, similar to the Growth and Stability Pact that we have on the European level. So it's inspired by that. We have a clear goal that we want to reach net zero emissions by 2045, and after that achieve negative emissions. We also have a climate law that is complementing the framework to make sure that future governments also will have to live according to these goals. And just like we have fiscal policy councils that oversee the fiscal policy framework implementation, we also have a climate policy council that oversees the implementation of this framework. I mean, this has just been started, but it's interesting how it actually shifts the debate in the public when we do have both this council and both the framework and the council. The second thing is when it comes to financial flows. I mean, this was very clear in the Paris Agreement. We need to redirect financial flows towards in a more sustainable way. We are trying to do our part, both through the public aid that we have, which is one of the per capita, I think by far the larger per capita donor to the Green Climate Fund. But we're also trying to work, for instance, with the World Bank Group to together with our public aid, together with the financial markets, to get more leverage on investments. We also back home have sustainable growth as a financial market objective, and for instance, our supervisor authority have now a mandate to integrate climate and sustainability risks to their supervision, because as just someone said, I mean, investing in fossil investments are not only climate risk today, they're actually also a financial risk today. So this is implemented for our supervisory authority. The third thing is carbon pricing. Sweden was one of the first countries in the world that introduced a carbon tax for almost 30 years ago, and it has been successful to reduce emissions. We have seen absolute decoupling in Sweden. Emissions have since 1990 decreased by 26%, and GDP has increased by 75% at the same time. It has been particularly successful when it comes to heating houses, where very, very few houses are heated by fossil fuels nowadays, even in winter when it's very cold. We have also some experience when increasing carbon tax and other taxes on climate and emissions, and at the same time cutting taxes for households to have it as a zero-sum game. This is also implemented by Canada recently. And I will do more during the coming years to increase climate taxes and cut taxes for households. But so far, what is the experience? Well, honestly, the experience is that the gas price at the pump is very visible. The tax cut is not as visible. So it's not necessarily something that is very popular with the public, at least this is my experience, and also when I discussed this with my Canadian colleague. And as I said, in Sweden, we have Greta and we have those demonstrations, but we also have demonstrations against the high gas prices. And there is a true concern among people with either low incomes or living in rural areas in Sweden, how they will in the future be able to get to the jobs, drive their kids to the football training, and their way of life. So clearly this is something we have to think more about. How can we, I mean, there's easy to increase these taxes, have it as a zero-sum game, but how do we do it in a way that is accepted by the public? I think it's also important that we are clear that there are trade-offs in these politics. Just let me take another example from Sweden. We did have a shortage of housing before the refugee crisis in 2015, when we received the largest number of asylum seekers per capita that any developed country has ever received. And we had the shortage of housing before, so we had to build lots of houses. And I do have a public subsidy for building new houses, new rental apartments where people with normal incomes can live. But the question is, how much of these subsidies should go to building energy-effective houses? And how much should I spend to just build a lot of houses? And there's a trade-off, and we have to find the right balance, strike the right balance. But it is, I think it's important that we can discuss. These are difficult trade-offs that we have to do. And just finish off, as I said, in order to be long-term successful, it's really important that we do policies that are accepted by a broad majority of politicians. Otherwise, we will have a backlash. So, as I finish, we just have to do it. So I know what I should do. I know I can do it, but I also have to figure out how to be re-elected while doing it, or at least not having a government that is denying climate change as the next government. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those pithy observations. I think one common point that I would mention, a number of ministers have talked about transport vehicles, prices at the gas pump, and so on. We really need, by 2030, to be only selling electric vehicles in the future. And I think from Europe's point of view, by the way, this is really existential. It's both arithmetically necessary that the transport sector be decarbonized, but it is also crucial for this vital industry in Europe, especially for Germany. Germany makes the best internal combustion vehicles in the world. Everybody loves to ride in German vehicles, no question about it. But we cannot go on with the internal combustion engine vehicles, so we're counting on Germany to make the best electric vehicles in the world, and for the European automobile industry to continue to thrive. China will do this. If Europe is going to make its own vehicles, it needs to decide that this is a European future. And I think it is one thing that the new Commission should certainly do, is to say what individual countries are doing right now, that we're not going to sell internal combustion engine emitting vehicles after 2030 should be an EU-wide policy. I think that Mercedes and Daimler-Benz and Volkswagen and everyone else will get the message very clearly. It's a huge market. It's the best automotive engineers in the world. But the decision needs to be made. And then the agony about the gas pump won't be an agony. There won't be gas pumps. There really won't be gas pumps. There will be electric vehicles. There will be the infrastructure that you're investing in to make sure that they can be managed, the public transport. You also make wonderful rail. We were on Spanish fast rail from Bukhara to Samarkand 2 days ago. So this was a Spanish fast rail. So we know you can do that in Central Asia, also through Belt and Road, but also throughout Europe as well, obviously. So I think that part of the solution is the fundamental change of infrastructure decided at the EU level, not at the agony of each country one by one, what will the future of transport be, but at the level of the European Union, that this is the transformation and that we need to get on with it. And I remember at Davos a couple of years ago with Carlos Ghosn in a different time, when he said to us, he said, I asked my experts what proportion of our vehicles should be electric by 2030. And the answer was 1/3 that he got back from his experts. And I raised my hand. I said, I don't think that could conceivably be the right answer. It has to be 100% if you look at what we're really up against. So I would just say that we're in a different game right now, where it isn't really a choice, do I like electric or not? It's to make this work. We know that we're very close to, and these are better vehicles, by the way, because they're a lot smarter, they can be a lot safer, they can be a lot more fun, they can do a lot of things that were not possible 20 years ago. But if there's foot dragging, I'm afraid Europe will lose the industry. And that would be a disaster, because the whole of European industry depends on the health of the German automotive sector, actually, not to mention your economy. So I think that this is an EU decision, actually at a policy level, not just at a market or gas pump level. Just a thought. Benigno, can I call on you? In a way, you're a little bit like the Iceland example, blessed with vast clean energy. So Paraguay is another case of a country that could go all clean, and I would love your thoughts.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank the invitation to Mr. Sachs and Mr. Larraín to be here. I'd like to tell you we signed the Helsinki Agreement on Thursday. We agree on that, and we're working on those issues. I don't know if you know, but Paraguay has had a tremendous success on the macroeconomic fundamentals over the last 15 years. But we know that our engines were mostly agribusiness as well as meat production. So those are very dependent of the use of the land and the trees. And we know that the situation has to be changed. Paraguay also has known as one of the owner of Itaipu Dam, which is the hydroelectric that we share with Brazil. And we are the #1 producer of clean energy in the world. We are put in the agenda the ODS, as well as the new treaty with the Brazilian, in order to use the energy to change our base model and the economic issue. We know that we have to go there. We are fully committed to go there and to have changes on the base of the economic, mainly on energy and clean energy. And we have also a young population that will help us to do so. So I'd like to thank you, all of you, and all the organizers for taking us here. Thank you very much.
We're very fortunate to have with us the leaders of the two core facilities for implementing the Paris Climate Agreement and the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Global Environment Facility and the Green Climate Fund. And these are two essential institutions for success. So if I could ask Naoko Ishii, the lead of the Global Environment Facility first, and then Yannick Glabarek, the head of the Green Climate Fund, to make remarks.
Thank you so much. First and foremost, I'd like to really thank Jeff and Felipe for organizing this very important meeting at Vatican. You may recall in 2015, the Holy Father issued an encyclical letter on care of our common home. And when that letter was issued, we at the GEF, Global Environment Facility, were really, really moved, and many staff are literally in tears, because we really resonate their message of how to fight against the global, what to save the planet, what to save or safeguard our global home. So that was really impressive, and we were so moved and also impressed at the power of the Holy Father has to mobilize the people. So again, that I really would like to congratulate you to have this important meeting at the Vatican. So fighting against this and fight against the climate change or global commons, I have two messages for this important group. And the first message would be that it is really important that you, the finance ministers, do have a deep understanding of why we have this challenge of the climate change. It's not just the energy issue, it's really the issue that we human activities have put so much of a pressure on the Earth system to the extent that the function of the Earth has changed these days. So in order for us to continue to rely on the Earth system for the stable and resilient environment, we need to actually find a way to change ourselves, our way of doing economic activities. So that Jeff has mentioned the important challenge of how to decarbonize our economy, and which is already very lengthy and important agenda. But it's not only just on how to decarbonize the economy, it's also how to transform our agricultural system. I recognize that land use is one of the important issues, but actually that how to feed now 10 billion people without degrading the environment anymore, which is a huge challenge. Then how also wanna change the way the cities will be built, and then how to move our linear economy to much more circular. I recognize the leadership provided by European countries on this issue, but all in all, I think it's very important that in order to address this climate change, we have to understand where this problem comes from. It leads to the conclusion that we need a total transformation of our economic system, not only energy transition, but agriculture and food and the cities and the circular economy. That requires finance ministers. I have been leading the GF for the last 7 years. It has been always so challenging to see that to get the attention of the finance ministers. You can't leave this important issue to environmental ministers anymore. You really need to step up and take the leadership to organize your powerful coalition among the ministers and the government. So that is my first plea. My second plea also comes from the same understanding that why we have this problem, if that the real issue is that our human economic activities have put so much pressure on the Earth system to their breaking points, it really needs to address not only climate issue, but also the biodiversity, ocean issue, that the chemical and land deforestation. This also needs a coalition, much broader coalition among finance ministries, but also the business and the CSOs, the communities, so that this is my next plea, and also final plea, that you please, that the finance ministers do have a much broader, deeper understanding of why we have this issue, and please exercise your leadership, not only at the government level, but also how to bring the business, how to bring the citizens and the communities and the CSOs, and then create a multi-stakeholder coalition to fight against this common challenges. And we are the GF, and I'm coming kind of maybe matured sister, and now I have a newborn, big brother, the Green Climate Fund, but those funds are here to serve you. And we are still dropping the ocean. I only have 1 billion per year, but those small amount of money can help you catalyze that political and policy coalition, and I really hope that we can deepen this conversation going forward. Thank you so much.
I want to say that not only can small amounts catalyze, but they should be large amounts. Given the stakes involved, we fundamentally underinvest in global public goods, and we fundamentally underinvest in these funds. It's a big mistake because we spend a lot of time to set them up, and then they are not provided with the resources that they should have in order to really do the job. And if we put our confidence in multilateral institutions, we have the best return possible. So I want also to say you need more money to the finance ministers, and to also encourage you to speak with your colleagues to make sure, because what happens is that the budget resources for these funds really are in the hands of environment ministers in the first instance, and they can't bring much. The financing is rather lost in this way. It's accepted at a low level, which doesn't really make sense compared to the scale of the challenges that we face. Let me turn to Yannick Glamarek, who is leading the complementary fund, the Green Climate Fund.
First of all, let me also thank you, Jeff and Felipe, for organizing this critical event, and also thank the speakers of this morning for some fascinating presentation. As mentioned by Jim and Christian, the shift toward a low-emission, climate-resilient society basically will substitute the fossil fuel costs for capital expenditure costs. And this is not a small challenge for developing countries. For developing countries that are not investment grade, it's next to impossible to access capital, even if it is for projects that potentially could be commercially viable. If we can access capital, it will be normally at a very high interest rate and with extremely short tenure, for 3 to 5 years. And so the Green Climate Fund has been established in 2011 to try to address this issue and foster a paradigm shift toward low-emission, climate-resilient development pathways in developing countries. What can we do? Through our partners, we can, in a sense, provide a range of grant and non-grant instruments to implement the 6 principles, Helsinki principles, articulated by Felipe this morning. And this means from helping developing countries to prioritize and program climate change intervention, to policy reform to establish an enabling environment through, for example, phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, or streamlining licensing processes, to providing blended finance in order to increase the rate of return of private sector flows, for example, through providing first loss equity or concessional finance. Several speakers have mentioned green bonds. We can provide grant assistance for policy support and guarantees as a credit enhancement mechanisms to enable a country to first float its first bonds. And the idea is to make sure that what is technologically feasible and what is commercially attractive becomes also financially feasible, which is not always the case right now in developing countries. I was fascinated by a number of the comments made. Several speakers have mentioned the importance of climate justice, of making sure that the transition toward a low-carbon, climate-resilient society is not at the expense of the poorest. And for me, one of the ways to do so is whenever we look at a climate initiative, to try to identify the initiatives that can maximize mitigation, adaptation, and development co-benefits. We have spoken a lot about mitigation this morning, but actually the best mitigation activities are also adaptation activities and development activities. For example, if we improve the building codes, it's not only about reducing energy, increasing energy efficiency, reducing greenhouse gas emission, and reducing climate change impact, but also it's about reducing energy poverty, and it's about increasing the resilience to heat wave. And for ministers of finance, I can deeply appreciate the fact that you want to take action without jeopardizing the re-election chances and making sure that you don't end up with an anti-climate change government next. One option is certainly also to change the narrative and make sure that whenever we speak about climate action, we highlight the mitigation, the adaptation, and the development benefits. Like the GEF, we are also public-funded institutions. We also depend on the support from all the ministries of finance around the world. This year is also our replenishment year for 2020-2024, and I would like to I would like to seize this opportunity to deeply thank Senora Espinosa Garces for having highlighted the importance of replenishment of the Green Climate Fund during the Climate Summit. I would like also to deeply thank Germany and Norway, because one of the reasons why we are embarking in this replenishment with a good chance of success, despite the fact that it's a difficult political economy, is because Germany and Norway took a very courageous decision last year, just before COP24, to double their contribution to the Green Climate Fund. And without that decision, I would hate to be the executive director having to manage a replenishment this year. And I would like also to deeply thank Sweden, because it's true, Sweden is the highest contributor per capita. And if everybody could take a page out of the German book, out of the Norwegian book, out of the Swedish book, we will have enough resources to accelerate dramatically the transition toward a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy in developing countries. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for that very important and timely message. And again, I would like to emphasize to all, at least my perspective, watching these institutions and other global funds like this, these are the most powerful ways to merge financial support with expertise that we have internationally. And they play this dual role of building systems at the same time as providing financial transfers. And so they play a unique role that bilateral aid doesn't quite do, and that certainly market finance alone can never do. And if we use these global facilities more ambitiously, we would absolutely accelerate progress dramatically. And it's a difficult period of multilateral finance, to be sure, but it's all the more important, again, and Europe's particular leadership role in this is really crucial and notable. Let me call on David Navarro, who has played a leadership role on just about every issue we're talking about, from climate, public health, food, nutrition, for the Secretary General over many, many years and many, many crises, and has always done so with remarkable success, from malaria control to Ebola to nutritional reform, and now is helping on planning the climate summit in September. David.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for those words. Colleagues, I'm going to make 4 points, but I would like to start by explaining that originally I'm a medical doctor, and actually I came in to the United Nations from the British government to work with Gro Harlem Brundtland, the former Prime Minister of Norway, who took over the World Health Organization in 1998. And the one activity which fills me with greatest pride was working with Dr. Brundtland and Kofi Annan on the setup of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. If you want one piece of evidence as finance ministers that these global mechanisms can be utterly transformative, the results of that global fund, particularly in terms of the well-being of people at risk of or affected by HIV/AIDS, and the reduction in the levels of malaria in our world today, is quite extraordinary. So I just wanted to give extra testament to Jeff's point about global financing mechanisms. Another one called the Global Fund, Global Facility on Food and Food Security and Nutrition, GAFSP, is also being strongly supported by one of the countries represented here. Thank you, Germany. If it wasn't for you, that very powerful mechanism would be languishing worse, and I hope that we can get it back up again. On my 4 points in relation to the climate summit are as follows. The Secretary General of the United Nations, when he was in Katowice at your marvelous COP last year, came away with the conclusion that the climate challenge needs more political energy from world leaders, and that this has to be put squarely back into the hands of national governments, although other actors, businesses, investors, NGOs, professional groups, and so on, can contribute a lot. There is no alternative to the leadership by national governments, and in particular that applies when shifting from what needs to be done and why to how it's going to be done and when. I think as Mr. Guterres has gone through his time as Secretary General, he's become more and more convinced that if he has one issue on which he really must succeed, it is on rebooting the way in which the world is approaching climate, linking it to the challenge of biodiversity and the sixth extinction, and also putting it at the center of sustainable development. He's particularly concerned about injustice, and when he was in Katowice, as some of you know, he actually came 3 times to that city. He was more and more affected by the reality of what is happening to countries that are being affected by climate change, and the sense that people are just being left behind to languish at the enormous numbers that we're all conscious of, but sometimes it's hard to take on board. It's hundreds of millions of people now being affected by climate change in front of our eyes, with consequences for livelihoods and for health and for life that are just almost too large to contemplate. So Mr. Guterres says, yes, the climate COP process is important, but he also says, I want to support Chile so that they have a really good COP25 by having a summit that raises ambition and leads to greater action. And I'm saying this to you now because actually you as Ministers of Finance, when you're talking to your heads of government and heads of state, can actually encourage them to come to the summit on September the 23rd, really filled with a real commitment to try to work with others to make a difference. Second point is, what are the issues that this summit is going to focus on? It's going to come up with a small number of strong propositions for shifts in the kind of areas we've been discussing today, but also with a lot on adaptation and resilience, and it's going to feature much more strongly than ever before the role of nature in contributing to climate action. In the earlier speeches, for example, by Jim Hansen, there was a strong indication that one of the additional things that must be done to support climate action is to sequester and capture more carbon from the atmosphere. Did you know that if we invested adequately as a world in nature, that we could actually contribute to sequestering 30% of the carbon in our atmosphere by 2030? And this is not made-up stuff. This comes from numerous peer-reviewed studies by scientists all over the world. And yet, nature is the forgotten solution. Investments in natural climate solutions, as they're called, receive only about 3% of total climate spending. So one of the issues that will come forward as a proposition in September is finding a way to invest more in preserving the forests that are the lungs of our world, whilst at the same time conserving peatlands, wetlands, grasslands, so that we can have a better carbon sequestration potential, at the same time reducing the contribution of agriculture and food systems to carbon emissions, currently well over 30% if you take into account land use changes. At the same time looking after our fresh water supplies, our watersheds, and at the same time paying attention to seas and oceans, which are currently actually at the limit of their carbon capture capacity and at risk of becoming more and more unstable in the ways that we've seen, for example, with the hurricanes off Mozambique recently. So let us give higher importance to adaptation and resilience. Let us also give higher importance to nature-based solutions, whilst continuing with the energy transition, industry transition, and infrastructure transition that has been described. And by the way, one side effect, important side effect of investing in nature, particularly when it comes to focusing on food and agriculture, is that can actually engage all 7.4 billion people in our world. It's not an elitist activity, it's an activity for all. And at the moment, that is something that, in the view of the Secretary General, is absolutely critical. Make climate action a universal, full participatory process, because that's the only way, as many of you have said in your statements just now, we can get results. So finally, as we go into the summit, there will be some who say, in the current political atmosphere, what's the point of trying to raise ambition on climate? We've got many countries that just don't want to move, they don't want to touch it, they want to run away from it. They see domestic political concerns more important. Well, there is the 2080 rule, and that is that if in any situation 20% of the actors take an issue seriously, they will form a peer pressure that will bring the other 80% on board. So if out of 193 member states in September, 20%, 1/5, or about 40 countries plus, can actually show that they're going to raise the ambition of their climate action, get more into their NDCs, even though they might not include the ones that Jeff identified just now, to use his words, as the thugs, I would like to suggest that this can be transformative. So please come, please be strong, please engage, even more than you're doing already. And I'd like at this stage to thank all the countries that are already participating in the 9 coalitions and having such an important influence on the way this is going to evolve. And let's hope that this climate summit in September, which will be surrounded by massive demonstrations, strikes, public pressure, that this climate summit can show that the nations of the world are ready to make that shift and put climate higher up the agenda, linking it to all the other priorities that we have right now. Thanks for the chance to say these words.
Thank you very much for, please, for a very important statement. Jim.
I'd like to make a comment that is related to several of the prior ones. I've had the opportunity over the last decade to visit at least a dozen countries where, for some reason, I get a lot of respect in other countries than the United States, and I'm able to speak to politicians at high levels. And the message that I try to take, and I really regret that I don't have the communication ability that somebody like Jeff does, because I had the chance to talk to people, and the message I gave was, we have to make the price of fossil fuels include their cost to society. And my suggestion was, because I'm particularly concerned about the reaction to higher fuel prices, is that you have to give the money to the public. And I had proposed in 2006 this simple idea of a carbon fee and dividend, where you give 100% of the money that you collect from the fossil fuel companies at the source, domestic mine or port of entry, give it uniformly to your legal residents. And if you look at the mathematics, it turns out that the lower income people tend to gain. 70% of the people actually make money. But in each case, I failed. In some very specific case, even in the Australia, which is a big quarry, and it's really a fossil fuel industry country, but they did elect a government that wanted to address this problem. Okay.